Hi, everyone. This week we are talking about industrialization, specifically industrialization of the North. We will come back and talk about industrialization of the South and a little bit more of the development of um, the commercialism and industrialization overall of the country, as well as westward expansion. A couple of the big things that we usually think of when we think about U.S. history. So, today, in Chapter 9, we'll be talking about the rise of manufacturing in the North. You'll learn some of the key players in that, and you'll learn some of the pros and cons of it. So let's jump into it and get started. So here's where we're starting. Before industrialization, we're at a point where we can have things created by an artisan, which, as you can expect, sounds really expensive, right? Or you can have it produced by a number of people, which saves a little bit of money. It's called the putting out system. It's where you put out a section of a job to a different person. And particularly at this time in the 1800s in the United States, it was generally to a family. Let's say in Malvern, maybe the Smith family was the best known for quality leather in town. So you might get the leather parts of your shoes cut and stretched and tanned by the Smith family. And then maybe the Jones family was the best in terms of stitching. And so they did all the stitching of the uppers and the soles and that sort of thing for a good quality pair of shoes. And then say maybe someone else added the soles or whatever, all of the different parts of the shoe. So it sounds kind of like an assembly line, but don't confuse it with that though, because assembly lines are very mechanized and there was nothing mechanical about this. It was all handwork, but done by a bunch of different people who weren't exactly super skilled, so they could charge a little bit less, and that's how they made their money. So the goods were cheaper because they were not made by an artisan. The rise of manufacturing, Great Britain was actually leading in manufacturing because honestly, they've just been doing it a lot longer than we had. Remember, right before the revolution, they had established the colonies so that the colonists would provide them with raw materials and raw goods, and they couldn't sell those to anyone else. They had to go to Great Britain. Great Britain would use that stuff to produce things like they would take iron ore or whatever, create whatever out of it, and then sell it back to us. So because we were not allowed to do our own manufacturing, and that's because Britain wanted to have the stronghold on it. To keep manufacturing as their stronghold, they even tried banning immigration of mechanics because they didn't want the technology to leak out everywhere else. But Samuel Slater was a mechanic who traveled from Great Britain to the US and actually became the founder of the first really successful cotton mill. And one of the things that led to this rise in manufacturing was Jefferson's embargo on British goods. And because of this embargo or this holdup, this order not to buy, that the US decided that we had to invest in our own industry, which is kind of ironic because Jefferson didn't really want us to become an industrialized nation as such. It was his dream that the United States would become something more of an agrarian society where we would all have plenty of land to produce plenty of food and all of the things that we needed. He just kind of saw us as a hardworking nation, striving to fend for ourselves, not so much striving for this commercialism that's going to develop out of manufacturing. But because of this embargo, the US had to start producing its own goods. Another reason for the rise of manufacturing was the War of 1812. You know how war does, it affects people's pocketbooks. There were financial problems that hurt many US businesses after the War of 1812. War is expensive. And because of that, many of these people turned to manufacturing in order to try to make up some money. Francis Cabot Lowell was one of these early manufacturers who kind of revolutionized the workplace. Now, for better or for worse, I'll let you decide that. But Lowell went to factories in Great Britain to visit, and then he came back and created from memory this power loom factory. And he was able to replace hand weaving with this massive power loom and a massive factory. So, oops, sorry, I don't mean to be popping through here. There we go. Um, as I mentioned, Lowell, right? He was one of these who developed a novel idea. He was like, you know what? Let's make a factory and let's put women to work. So it was kind of an interesting concept because women really had not had the opportunity to work outside the home or farm or to live outside the house. I mean, they went from their parents' home to their husband's home, and it's pretty much how it was. This idea of Lowell's factory gave women an option to marriage and gave them an opportunity to get exposed to different cultures and that sort of thing. So kind of opened up some opportunities for women. Now, Lowell, Massachusetts, and the factory at Waltham, Massachusetts, were both centers for women's factory work. These mills were built near water because they required hydropower. They had to be built near a river for this water power. But when electricity came along, that all changed. Everything had equal opportunity as far as towns go that were fighting for industry. Because if you had electricity, you didn't need to have a river nearby. But as I mentioned, Lowell's novel idea was to give women the opportunity to work. They lived outside the home, and it gave them options for marriage. And so these women then start gaining appreciation for work, for factory work. They also start questioning the fairness of industrial order. So uh, we have women who are looking to improve their situations. Speaking of their situations, in the Northeast, especially in Lowell and Waltham, these factories had boarding houses with chaperones. They had very strict rules for the women who lived in them. So think of a dorm for ladies. That's what we're talking about. These women worked 12-hour days, and talking was forbidden at work. Now they could talk at home. It's not like they were trying to be mean. All work and no play makes them dull or whatever. But it was more about the inability to talk during work. One, you had to watch the machinery. You didn't want that to get away from you. But two, you couldn't talk over the machinery. It was loud. No swearing or drinking was allowed of the women, and they were required regular church attendance. Now remember, these people are working 12-hour days and they're working 6 hours a week, just like men who work in factories. So they were required to attend church on their one day off. And as you might imagine, that was seen as quite a social event. Because of these strict rules, many farm families were okay sending their daughters to work in cities. It gave them more opportunities, gave them an opportunity to feed themselves, gave them an opportunity to try new things, and like I said before, just experience new culture in general. So in terms of the results of mechanization, there were more goods out there because, you know, the mechanization made them faster to be produced. And the faster they were produced, the lower they could sell them for. So we have a lot of goods circulating, and they're not very expensive, which gives people a chance to buy more. Um, then it also spurs the development of other factories, not just textile factories or fabric mills. So we're talking about factories to make shoes or to process leather and that sort of thing, gun making and clock making even, two things that had been very much an um, artisan skill at one time. So this leads to the rise of consumerism because all these low prices and all these products out there means that more people can afford to buy. Kind of, sort of, in a way. We'll talk about that in a minute. But so some of these items are no longer seen as luxury items. The biggest one, oil lamps. Now, you may have one in your home. I mean, we still have one around here for an emergency. I haven't had an emergency where I've had to use an oil lamp in probably 45 years, something like that. We use tap lights or flashlights or LED lights or whatever, our phones. Anyway, so, but oil lamps were a big deal then, and they were top of the line because they were so much brighter than candles. They were affordable, they could be used indoors, and they were used outdoors too. Parlor stoves are also important during this time because people can gather and you can heat a room. and so people can visit for fun and enjoyment. So we actually have leisure time developing and quality of life improving. Cook stoves had multiple burners, and so you could cook more. You could cook faster for a larger family. And things like carpet, furniture, and wallpaper are also starting to get affordable in the 1800s. So I said kind of sort of could afford some of these luxuries. So let's talk about that for a minute. Um, if you were a farmer or an artisan, you kind of had control of your own time. If you didn't want to get up at 5:30 to start work on the farm, you could go to work at 7 and probably not have any problems. Same with an artisan. If you're sculpting something and you don't want to mess with it until tomorrow, chances are it didn't cause you any problems. However, if you were a factory worker, there were problems, lots of problems, because factory work was very strict, and they many times docked pay unfairly. If you were just a couple of minutes late, if you were like 5 minutes late, you could lose hours of pay. And to top it off, if you were late very often, there was always someone on a waiting list just ready to take that job from you. So you had to watch your back. Most of these people worked 12-hour days and 6-day work weeks, as I've already mentioned. The thing I want to point out here is that wages were low, very low. $300 a year was the average wage for a man. Now, I know when we start thinking about today, it was like, oh, gasp, how could that even be? All right, you got to remember, cost of living was way different then. But $300 a year for men. It took $600 a year to care for a family of 5. Now, that's to care for a family of 5. That's not to like afford piano lessons and all of that, all of the fine stuff. I mean, that's to take care of a family of 5. So we are talking about a factory working experience here that's very indicative of the term the working poor. So we start to see this labor movement begin to develop because, people are realizing they are among the working poor. The women who were away from home bonded together and they began to protest work conditions and pay. They wanted fair pay. They formed a couple of different organizations to fight, like the Lowell Factory Girls Association organized strikes and fought wage cuts. And then the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association protested the 12-hour workday. Now, these strikes were rarely successful, but they did give women a voice in the labor movement, which was unusual for the time, very novel. And in terms of critics of industrialization, they said that the factory owners made big money, but the workers hardly made any. And that's pretty true when you look at that $300 a year that men earned, and it took $600 for a family of 5. So they were working a lot of hours for very little money. The labor theory of value says that the value of a product should accurately reflect the labor needed to produce it, and went on to say that workers should even get a distribution of profits proportionate to their work. Also important to the labor movement during this time is Thomas Skidmore, who organized the Working Men's Party. He protested the exploitation of workers and wanted to end debtors' prison and to have equality for all workers. First of all, let me apologize for the extra E in workers there. Sometimes if I'm typing notes late, my hands get away from me, so I'm sorry about that. But I want to point out something about Thomas Skidmore. He wanted to end debtors' prison. So if you owed money, if you owed a huge debt you couldn't pay, the penalty was generally serving time in debtor's prison where you worked off that fine. So if you are in debtor's prison, where are you not? Right, you're not at work. So if you're in debtor's prison working off a debt, then you're accruing more debt while you're there because you're not at work. So you can't keep up with your obligations. It was a vicious cycle. And so people like these women from the Lowell Factory Association organizations and Thomas Skidmore for the Working Men's Party are starting to think in a more progressive way as they start looking for ways to improve the labor movement. So something else comes up here that kind of has an impact on the economy. The federal government starts selling public domain land. So they're able to sell 640-acre parcels for $2 an acre in 1796. Now that land was in Ohio, but it was to encourage people to move to the Northwest. And then the land law of 1800 reduced the minimum parcel size by half and set up sales on credit to encourage farmers to move to the Northwest Territory. Now, the reason they set up sales on credit to move to the Northwest Territory is because banks just weren't loaning money for it. Um, so when the state banks would not lend money for farmers to get this public land, because let's face it, the farmers knew a good deal when they saw one, right? But they can't get money from the bank to buy it. So states created more banks that would lend money. So now you have a lot of banks floating around lending money that they really don't have because they just print more. So the money was worthless, which made the land prices really skyrocket. So that was a problem that starts leading us into an economic depression. Also, during the War of 1812, the Bank of the U.S. had suspended its payments of, hard money like gold and silver coinage. If the clients demanded payment in that, the bank would have crashed. So the Second Bank of the U.S. made risky loans and created more inflation. And all of that led to the Panic of 1819, which really was the country's first economic depression. We usually think about the depression as the, 1929, the Great Depression. This one was 10 years earlier, and it was big for the people who lived it at the time. Okay, let's move on to transportation with railroads and canals, because that's really how most of the transportation was done, although we do have the development of our first federal highway at this particular point, the Cumberland Road. Construction started in 1811 to run the highway from Maryland to Illinois. The federal government built the road, and local and state governments built turnpikes and toll bridges up to it. The Erie Canal linked the Hudson River, New York City, the Atlantic seaboard, and the Great Lakes and Mississippi River Valley. And by linking all of those together, they were able to decrease shipping costs and travel time actually to the west. And the Wabash and Erie Canal from the early 1940s was the longest stretch of canal in North America at 450 miles in length. So railroads. In the late 1820s, steam engines really start competing with the horse-drawn ones, and the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad is the first steam locomotive in the United States. So railroads increased in the mid-1800s, and we had 30,000 miles of railroad track down by the start of the Civil War. Of course, the Civil War itself halted that railroad track laying because, the war gets in the way. So let's wrap up by talking about the middle class and the working class. I want you to understand the difference between these two that grew out of this industrialization of the North and Northeast. So the middle class grew up from these entrepreneurial artisans and small merchants. They were terrified that they might fall into the working class, so they worked their tails off to stay in the middle. They valued cleanliness, discipline, morality, hard work, education, and manners. Women worked in the home to care for children and to take care of the house. Part of this whole idea of keeping women in the home was to educate the children and to teach them discipline and morals and manners and that sort of thing. So that's why it was very important for the middle class to have the women working in the home. We still hear a lot about this today. When we talk about our economy, people tend to look at the situation of the middle class to determine, kind of as a peg to determine how the economy is doing. Do we have a strong middle class? If we have a strong middle class, then generally people will say our economy is doing well. So these people very much did not want to fall out of the middle class because they knew what was waiting for them: long-hour workdays in factories and horrible conditions. The working class, their goal was to try to keep women and children from working in factories. We will learn more about child labor laws and that sort of thing that develop from the progressive movement of the labor movement, but very much the goal was to keep women and children from working, although occasionally education took a back seat to work. I mean, sometimes you just had to go to work and help your family. Wives often took in additional work. Sometimes they would, do laundry for other people. They do that in their home, or they do sewing. They might even go clean other people's homes. And they did have a degree of leisure time, though. So, we kind of think about that with the middle and upper class. The working class, at least at this point, they do have some things that they can do, some fun things on the cheap, like they can go to circuses and they can hang out at taverns and they go to baseball games. Baseball was a big deal at this time. So I hope that answers all the questions you have about industrialization in the Northeast during this time period, and stick around through the next couple of weeks and we will talk more about industrialization.